I think the reality of Baldur's Gate 3 is becoming more and more apparent as you look at the statements released by its dev team, by its competitors, and by the industry at large, right? Because we were told, like, when this game came out, that it was one of the best games ever made. It was one of the best games on PC. It was like the game of the year by far. It was like this huge monumental thing, right? It was this huge success story according to the media. But of course, the reality is quite a bit different. We know the game critic scores are bought and paid for. We know that the player counts on Steam are botted, right? We know that most players never got past Act One. We know. Okay, we know the game only sold like at the very most 15 million copies, trailing well behind The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. We know Baldur's Gate 3 was not the huge, massive, monumental success story that it's made out to be, right? If it was, Wizards of the Coast would have immediately contracted Larian for a sequel or some other D&D thing, right? Like they wouldn't have been kicked to the curb immediately. Is what I'm saying. So that leads to the question of like, well, if Baldur's Gate 3 success is completely fake, what exactly is the purpose behind it? And I do think all you have to do to figure that out is look at what people actually talk about in regards to the game, right? They're not discussing the gameplay or the story or the characters or the mechanics. None of that matters, right? What actually matters is that they have been able to create the illusion that a massively woke product became ludicrously successful. And I do think that's like the big major takeaway here. When you look at like interviews from the staff, when you look at what like other companies are saying, like this game is what people are going to use to justify throwing woke content into games, right? They're gonna try and shift the blame from for games failing away from woke content, woke culture, woke decisions, into trying to like blame other arbitrary things, right? They're going to try blaming like mechanics and demographics and gamer burnout or whatever they're trying to do. Like they're going to do everything they possibly can to avoid the elephant in the room and talking about woke hiring practices and design philosophies, right? They are going to avoid talking about that. And I do think like the recent interview from Bethesda in regards to this is very, very telling because the illusion of Baldur's Gate 3 was this idea that like, oh, this game has a lot of decisions. It's really heavy on the RPG element. It's the best RPG we've gotten in a long time, right? You know, everybody has been saying this about Bethesda for a long time. They no longer produce RPGs. What they produce are just these weird open world like pseudo RPGs where your character gets progressively stronger with no real like thought put into like a into balance or making the character interesting at all. Like, you know, having your character like role play, essentially. It's not really what Bethesda produces are not really RPGs, to be completely honest with you. So Bethesda acknowledged this in their statement. They said that Baldur's Gate 3 was this huge success story and that it did so much for the RPG genre, but the Elder Scrolls 6 isn't going to change anything. Doesn't that tell you anything about the reality of the situation? Doesn't that tell you anything about the current state of things and how things are actually progressing? Because nobody actually liked Baldur's Gate 3. You know, people had issues playing the game, they had issues with the mechanics, they had issues with like the dice rolls and like building the characters, right? Like Baldur's Gate 3 completely and totally failed at captivating an audience outside of like the Fujoshi like gay shippers. Okay. Like Baldur's Gate 3 was not particularly successful as a video game. And Bethesda knows this. They know that in order to reach the biggest possible demographic, you know, the lowest common denominator, they're going to have to casualize all of those RPG elements. They're going to have to strip them all away. They're going to have to produce, like, remove the dialogue wheels. They're going to have to they're gonna have to have these like simplified quest structures and there's more linear stories, right? They're gonna have more elaborate set pieces. Like they're gonna be do what Bethesda has been doing for over a decade at this point, right? Because the long and short of it is nobody actually liked Baldur's Gate 3. Okay, this is why no developer is seriously looking at the game and wants to emulate its success and want to really look at what makes it work and what people find appealing about it, because nobody finds it appealing, right? Nobody really enjoys Baldur's Gate 3 at its core, right? The reason the game was propped up was to first of all push the woke agenda, which is the most important thing for game journos and the industry at large, and more like just as importantly, to downplay Nintendo, to downplay what Nintendo was doing, to try and create this narrative that Switch didn't have, that Nintendo's biggest titles couldn't compete with PC, that Zelda was way less popular than Baldur's Gate 3, that Mario was irrelevant. Like, again, they had to create the illusion that these games completely bombed. Right? That was a major thing, a focus for them, even though that those games were way more popular than Baldur's Gate 3 will ever be, right? Again, you can simply look at just what has happened over the past year as proof of that. With Tears of the Kingdom, you're constantly seeing people talk about the game. You're seeing them bring it up. It's gotten a sequel already. Mario is just huge right now with Prince of Peach Showtime and Mario Party Jamboree. Like, you have all of these like banger things that are happening in the Nintendo sphere. Oh, but we can't talk about that. We have to pretend that Baldur's Gate 3 is some unprecedented success, even though Mario Party probably outsold it within like a week. Okay. Like, again, we are in this situation where game journos are actively denying reality, right? Where they're trying to like create this narrative that games like Dragon Age Veilguard, like Baldur's Gate 3, are these huge, massive success stories when really they're not. Like, in reality, like, I think it's safe to say that a lot of fans have issues with the way things are proceeding right now. With games like Starfield, with Hogwarts Legacy, with Spider-Man 2, Alan Woke 2, right? We were told that these were some huge, successful products, and yet all of them fell flat in the face of Nintendo, right? Like Baldur's Gate 3, in spite of all the hype, all the publicity, all the praise, it simply didn't live up to the narrative.